Welcome and thank you for coming to our webinar. Today we're very happy to have Paul Withers from Intech with us for his session titled, Marty, You're Just Not Thinking Fourth Dimensionally. This webinar is brought to you as part of the free monthly webinar series from Team Studio and TLCC. My name is Courtney. I'm the marketing manager at Team Studio, and I'm here today helping to run this webinar. Howard Greenberg and Paul Delanebbia from TLCC are joining me today, and the three of us are your hosts. Here at Team Studio, we provide software tools for Notes and Domino professionals. We've been helping our customers build and maintain customized Notes applications for more than 20 years, and last month we debuted a brand new tool. Team Studio Advisor tells you what applications you have, who is using them, how complex they are, and what their value to your organization is. It scans through your Domino servers, finds all the applications, measures their true business usage, records the business value, and analyzes the complexity of the applications. Advisor then recommends a forward path for each application. If any of this sounds interesting, please take a look at our website, www.teamstudio.com/advisor. And now I will pass the controls over to Howard Greenberg at TLCC so he can go over some administrative points like how to ask questions. Then we'll give Paul the floor for his presentation. I am passing the controls over to you now, Howard.
Oh, thank you, Courtney. Good morning and good afternoon and good evening, everybody. Welcome to our last webinar of the year. Hard to believe that the year is about to come to a close. Just a little bit, I'm here along with my partner, Paul Delanebbia, and just tell you a little bit about TLCC and some upcoming webinars that we are thinking of. And then we'll pass the controls over to Paul Withers to get started. Many of you know us here at TLCC. We've been around since 1997. Doing distance learning courses for Notes and Domino and, of course, XPages since it came out. We have a free demo course, Introduction to XPages, if you are just getting started with XPages. Paul and I also spend most of our time doing mentoring and consulting. So if you are getting started with XPages or need to make the next step and need a little extra help, we can help you, and we can also develop your applications for you if you don't have in-house staffing to do that. And we can also do private classes at your location or virtually. As I said, we spend most of our time, Paul and I, doing development work. We've done a lot of work converting apps over to XPages using Bootstrap, and a lot of the work we do involves a lot of use of Java, as well as working with relational backend databases and integrating relational databases to Domino and XPages. And being instructors, we're also very good at, as we do the work, at transferring skills to yourselves or your in-house development team. Upcoming webinars, we actually don't have anything planned right now, but we definitely want to have a couple thoughts in mind. As many of you know, Java 8 will be in the next fix pack for Notes and Domino, and that brings a bunch of new features that will be enabled in your Java code. So we're definitely going to try to cover that, and some other thoughts, as well as probably try to get IBM back in here after the Connect conference to talk about what's new. There was plans that they were going to talk about a new application modernization strategy for Domino apps. So definitely have some things that we're working on. So watch our website and our newsletters for upcoming webinars. In the meantime, all our previous webinars going back a couple of years are available at our website at the URL up on the screen. So, if you're looking for some education on something, want to review or learn some new topics, check out those webinars. As far as asking questions, so we're going to cover your questions at the end of Paul's presentation, but go ahead and ask your questions as Paul is speaking, as you think of them. The way you can ask your questions is in the GoToWebinar interface, and there's a questions panel. If you don't see the questions panel, there's a little orange arrow to expand the GoToWebinar interface, and then you can see the questions panel and expand that and ask your question. So we, again, will answer your questions verbally at the end of the webinar. So we will not be responding to questions in the questions pane, but we'll accumulate those and get them at the end when Paul's done speaking. So without further ado, let me introduce Paul Withers, who's a technical genius in the XPages community. If any of you haven't followed his blog, there's a lot of great information out there. And I've seen Paul's presentation before that he's going to do. It really has a lot of great tips. So Paul, we're going to transfer controls over to you.
Thank you.
Let me make you the presenter. You should have, there we go, Paul. We see your screen, Paul.
Great. So this was a session that I initially delivered at Connect at the beginning of this year, and it's probably been one of the biggest sessions that it took me to kind of put everything together, simply because it kind of came out of a lot of questions that I was seeing on Stack Overflow last year, as well as some problems that I caused myself by trying to be too clever, which we'll see as we go through. But a lot of it comes back to thinking fourth dimensionally, thinking of not only seeing the X page itself and the current browser page, but being aware that there's a process in between. There's a process in between clicking a button on the web page and the web page coming back, that whole partial refresh area, and understanding what the situation, what the state of the data and the content of the X page is at a particular point is critical to really understanding all of that. Just a background, we tend to have the typical who am I slide, and given the content, there was only one possible slide there. Just to give a bit of background on me, I'm also an OpenNTF board member. I've been involved in a number of OpenNTF projects, been an IBM champion since it started in 2011, and a Domino developer for over 15 years now, and then moved into XPages. And a lot of the stuff that I've been doing around XPages has been really getting to understand what's happening under the hood, both with working and doing sessions with Tim Tripconi, who knew everything about XPages, and work with things like the OpenNTF Domino API, but also just digging in and really seeing what's happening under the hood. So, as I say, we're covering a lot of areas here that around processes and breaking those processes down into their individual steps in order to identify where things might be going wrong, and to understand that there's a difference between what you see in Domino Designer as an X page and what the current state of the browser is. In the slides, which I'll share, they're also already on SlideShare, there are a lot of references to Stack Overflow questions. This isn't about naming and shaming. That's not the kind of person that I am. This is, to be honest, if those people hadn't asked those questions, then a lot of developers would be sitting there scratching their heads and wouldn't be able to solve the same problem themselves. It's often been said there's no such thing as a stupid question, just stupid answers. So some of those, no doubt, I've entered on Stack Overflow, but hopefully not too many. So we're going to be covering various themed elements in here. So let's go on to the first one. So this part of it is really about data sources, the timings of the page initializing, and saving documents. So in terms of creating documents, there are a lot of properties in XPages that can be computed, and the document ID is one of those. But it's worth bearing in mind that even though those kind of properties are expected to return a piece of data, in this case a string document ID or note ID. The document ID property can also take a note ID. It's worth bearing in mind that although those can just return or are expected only to just return a piece of data, other code can be used in there as well. And this can be a way to actually keep all of that code that is related in a single chunk. So what I'm doing here is, this is a scenario where you want to have a single profile document, as it were, for the database. In this particular scenario, I only want one document, but I also want to create a second document as well. Now, the thing to bear in mind here is that even though that's then running, I'm then also passing those IDs into session scope and returning the current the document ID for the first document that I'm creating. I've just noticed that I think that should be a hash there. So I'm computing the document ID, putting that one document into session scope, and creating a second document that's related to it, and putting that document ID in session scope, and then returning the first document ID. So that's referring to this data source. So when we go into it, then it's just creating that document, and everything looks fine, except when you look at the database, and that all looks okay, and when we save it, we've then got a save conflict in there. We've got a save conflict in there. That's something that you tend to get quite a bit, but it's worth looking at at what's happening here in the life cycle. So it's creating those documents, and it's running that code multiple times here. So we've got it twice in the before page load and twice in the render response, where it's calculating all of that code. There are some properties like document ID, for example, that are not going to be relevant. We're only going to want them once. So those are the ones that we should be putting as computed on page load. So if we just go to the data source and just bring up there, then this is where we're changing it from compute on page from compute dynamically to compute on page load. And now when we go to that, it's now just computed it just once. So thinking about those kind of things and how we can actually optimize the performance there. And it was when I was dealing with this that I then started looking at other settings. So here, if we go back to the server console, we're seeing that that is calculating during the page load event. That's specifically because this data source is attached to a panel. Data sources can be attached to the XPage, to a custom control, and also to the panel. And one of the things that you've probably come across is that using viewscope variables, and sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. Here I'm using setting a viewscope variable in before page load for the view that I want to use. If I attach this data source to the XPage itself and then refresh that page, so that we're running that calculation again, then we get an error. Looking at the server console, now that particular error is coming up when it's creating the component tree. It's not coming up, it's not doing that calculation during the before page load event as it was before. It's doing it much earlier in the life cycle, and before the before page load event, which is where we're setting that viewscope variable. It's having to do that basically because this data source is attached to the XPage, so it's not attached to a component, so it can't come back to it later on and calculate it later on. It's needing to calculate it up front. So this is one reason why adding those data sources to a panel may actually be a bit more beneficial. And now we see that code's calculating fine because the viewscope variable has already been initialized. If we save it, then everything seems to work fine. And if I go back to the home, then the link here is going to that particular document. You can see the URL at the bottom there, because it's picking up that that session scope variable has now been set. If I then save it, then we get extra documents. And now, whereas before we just had the save conflict on the dummy doc, we've also got the save conflict on the first one as well. The reason for that save conflict is coming back to ignore request params. I've got two data sources here, and if I go to the All Properties panel, then that will become more obvious. So I've not got ignore request params set on the first one, obviously, because that's picking up from the URL. I haven't got it set on the second one. What this means is that I'm basically editing this document with both data sources, with both forms, and I'm saving both fields, I'm saving the fields into both of those documents, or the fields from both forms into that document. It might seem it's something that everyone hits is not setting ignore request params, and the key then is adding that onto the second data source. Actually, we're calculating it on the first data source as well. We're calculating the document ID, so we can set it on that first data source as well. Because we're calculating that document ID, with ignore request params not set to true, it's basically ignoring anything that we code in document ID. It's still running the code, but it's ignoring, it's overriding the result from it by using what's in the URL. And now if we delete those, and I'll need to clear the session scope variables. Now it works fine the first time, and it also works fine the second time when we've got the URL in there. The key thing to note there is that without ignore request params as true, everything seems to work fine the first time we go in, because there was nothing in the URL. The URL was just the XPage name itself. We hadn't got a document ID. So the first time we went in and saved it, we did get 2 documents there. It's the subsequent times that when we've got something in the URL, that it's using that document to edit both data sources too. One of the things that is particularly relevant is the persistence, and this is the one that I'm picking up here. There are a number of options. Default option will typically be keep only current page in memory. That means it's keeping the component tree for the page. So for each of these XPages, it's building this tree of components that we see here in memory, loading, setting various settings for them. So we've got the panel here, within that the computed field, the button, a line break control, another button, data view. It's building that tree of components, and for the relevant settings, the default is to keep that component tree in memory, but then when you go to another page, store it down to disk so that you're only keeping the current page in memory. The option that I've got here is to keep all pages in memory. So that means that it's a bit quicker because you're not going to disk each time. However, there's only a finite amount of memory. So if you've got large pages and lots of users, then that's going to have a bigger overhead. The other option is to keep pages on disk, and that will write everything down to disk. If you've got an SSD over a very quick network, then that's not going to be a problem. But it's also going to mean that you've got more storage there. There's much more space available. The default option, as I say, is to keep the current page in memory. So for every current browser session, it will keep that component tree in memory and subsequently write to disk. I will say current browser session because if I click this close button at the top of the browser, obviously there's nothing to tell the server that that browser session no longer exists. There's no connection back from the browser to the server. So as far as the server is concerned, that current page is still a current page. It will still keep that current page in memory. That becomes an issue if you've got something from, say, email or whatever, where people are clicking links and opening a new browser page, closing it, clicking on another link, which is opening another browser page and closing it, because you start getting a lot of sessions, because they're all separate sessions then, because they're closing the browser in between. Similarly, if I just right-click here and open in a new window, and open that in a new tab, and open that in a new tab, and open that in a new tab, then it's the same session. That then becomes a problem if I want to do anything. So I want to collapse that, for example, or collapse all, or go to another page. It's not working because I'm only keeping 4 pages in memory. The export view works fine though. That's because that export view button, if we look at the design, is just running client-side JavaScript. So obviously that's going to work fine because it's not needing that component tree. Whereas the collapse all, expand all, collapsing of categories, it's going back to the server. Export view is going back to it's making a request to open this new page, but it's not relying upon any information from the browser. And now, because we've got 5 other pages open, it's dumped the component tree for this page. So when it's trying to get that component tree to go to the next page, to collapse those categories, there is no component tree, so it can't do anything. The only way to get it is to refresh the page, and then they work. But of course, then one of these other pages, component trees, has now been dumped from memory because we're only keeping 4 pages in memory. I think on the slides I have the I haven't got the number of pages that it keeps there. I think it's in the XPages portable command guide. I think by default it's something like 16 pages, but you need to be aware of those, particularly if people are opening additional pages. The other place where you need to be aware of it is with something like this export view button, which is opening a separate X page to load up an Excel instance. On that particular X page, all I'm doing is in the before render response is generating, it's using Apache Poi to generate an Excel sheet. And the X page itself has been set to rendered false, but it's still creating a component tree for that page. So it's still using up one of these 4 maximum pages in memory. There's no point though, because this Excel page, this X page code is generated, the Excel posted, but it's Excel, so there's no way from there to interact with this component tree. There is a setting then in the X page for view state, and for an X agent like this, that should always be set to no state, because there's no point in keeping any state data about it, no point in keeping a component tree for it. to identify the current state of the browser page, because the browser page isn't a browser page, it's an Excel spreadsheet, so there isn't any way to interact with the previous version of it. Just to give some background on exactly what that view state equals no state means, let's just set it on this first X page. And the data view is a good way here to see what that statefulness really means. So I can collapse all, I can expand all, I can go to, I can show and hide the details, I can go to page 2, I can go to page 5, I can go back to page 1. And I can also go to the next page to get to page 2. But if I go to the next page, I'm still on page 2. However many times I click it, I'm still on page 2, because I'm not keeping this component tree. I'm not keeping the state of this current page. So this data view, its particular data there, oh sorry, actually on the data view itself, the first, it's showing 5 rows, but the first is not set. So the first row is always going to be the first row in the view, which means that when I go to page, when I click to go to the next page, it's saying, okay, my first was element 0, row 0. I'm going 5 rows, so my first is now row 6, 5 plus 1. When I click to go forward again to the next page, it's saying, okay, my default is that the first is 0, go forward 5 rows. So it's still going to that second page, because it's going to the next page from the default, which is page 1. Similarly, if I just go back and collapse the first category and then collapse the second category, it's expanding that first category again, because it's not storing the state. So the state of that first category by default is expanded. So when I do something else in the view, then that default state for that first category returns again. One thing just to bear in mind is here, expanding the details, that is working. That's because there's a setting on the data view called details on client. So here that's set to true. That basically means that any interaction with the details area, this area here, is only done on the client. As we can see when I expand it and show Firebug, if I collapse everything, if I collapse a category and expand a category, we can see it's sending a request to the client, to the server. But when I expand the detail or collapse, it's not. That's just all of these details areas. So this bit are passed down to the browser when the page is first loaded, and it's just using CSS to hide it. The expand collapse is just using CSS to show and hide it. That's a very useful thing. If you've got all of the details areas expanded by default, then it should definitely be on, because there's no way to those details areas will be shown by default, so there's no point going back to the server just to hide it. Similarly, if it's just picking up column values, again, it's worth setting it by default and avoiding that round trip. If you've got a lot of detail in here, a lot of functionality, you're showing a lot of rows, it's going off and looking up a lot of different documents, then it may be worth, and it's not shown by default, then it may be worth not setting that details on client. But it's certainly a setting that's worth bearing in mind there. So now we're going to start looking at repeat controls, and one of the common questions that comes up around repeat controls is interacting with particular rows with server-side JavaScript. And a lot of this comes from a misunderstanding about the component tree and what's actually stored. Now, we're talking about all repeating controls, so a data view, a view panel, but also a repeat control. This repeat control, this one, has a single, it's got the repeat control in there, and it's got a single computed field in there. And just for clarity then, I'm using the current row index in there as well. The key thing to bear in mind here is that in terms of any repeating control, the component tree on the server side, and this is something that the debug toolbar is extremely useful for showing. This is the component tree on the server side, which is the whole XPage. Here's that repeat control, which is a custom control. Here's that computed field, which is in a custom control. That particular repeat control, all that we've got in the component tree is a single set of components. There's just one component in the repeat here, but it's just a single component. So that means that if you want to interact with this row, or this row, or this row from outside of that repeat control, it doesn't exist. There isn't a concept of row 1, row 2, row 3 from outside of the repeat control as far as the server side is concerned. It's just a single set of components, not bound to any particular element in that repeat. It's just a single set of components that's abstract, as it were, which means that you can't get to a particular row from server side. You can from client side, and this is where I'm setting the style class, for example, here. So I'm using the row index there so I'm setting the style class as use this plus then the current row index. So the first row is use this 0, second row use this 1, third one use this 2. So that means that it's possible to use that style class to access that particular component or that particular set of components from outside of the repeat control, up here for example, or down in this button further down, to interact with a particular row client side. I won't be able to do it from the server side event of this button because server side, as I was saying, there is just one element there. A lot of you probably have noticed this one here, the second one. That is, if we come down to that second component with the tenant, then we'll see that that's repeat controls equals true. This basically means that at load time, it should create a separate set of components for each row of the data. And I'm setting the ID to row data with the current index. Now it's got a number on the end of it. For the first one, it was just row data because there was no current index at the time that it was generating those components. So think of it like Marty and the various tenants. This is exactly the same Marty in all those different time periods, but it's a different Tannen back in 1885 compared to Biff Tannen in 1985 and Griff Tannen in the future in 2015. They're different people. It's the same actor who's portraying them, it's the same template, as it were, but they're different people. But here, it's the same person in all places, all based on that same template. The other thing to bear in mind here is the dynamic content control. So there, we've just got one repeat there, but we're switching the contents between the two. In the component tree, it's only loading the current facet. It's only loading the default facet first and then loading the other facets as and when they're required. So it's great for performance. One thing just to bear in mind there is that we're not seeing this list change here because the switch is just switching this area of the page, so we can't see those updated here. The other thing with these repeat controls, which again comes to a question that comes up a fair bit, is around passing data sources down to custom controls. So I've got a custom control here for the actual computed field. I've got a custom control for the repeat control here. So I'm using a category filter there it's looking across to this this view here and picking up the relevant category based upon the name that's being passed in as a parameter for that person repeat. So I'm setting name equals Marty there, and it's name equals Marty there and name equals Tannen there. So it's passing that piece of data down because that's going to change each time, and it's not actually defined anywhere else around here. Within this component, I'm not passing any data down. If we look at the property definition here, I'm passing the name down, but I'm just to display it. But I'm not passing down the person object. I'm not passing down the current index. I'm just using those because at the time that it needs to be used, that custom control is injected into as a child of the repeat control, custom control. So I don't need to pass data sources down. As long as the variable name exists and the person variable and the IDEX person variables exist on this repeat one component in the outer custom control, I can then use them in the inner custom control. That does mean that anyone who uses this custom control needs to include, needs to specify the index var as IDEX and the variable name as person. But there are ways that we can do that, and this is where the design definition comes in. So you may have seen when I was in the design tab, I've just put some useful text on there that says any implementation of this custom control will expect the following variables. IDEX will be the index var and person is the var. So then anyone who drags that custom control, which is this one, onto the page, knows that they're responsible for making sure that IDEX exists and person exists. If they don't, and it won't here because it's just standalone, then it's not going to work, and it's their fault. It needs to be put in here. But I'm giving the person who's dragging it onto the page all the information to get it working right. So that means that a lot of data sources don't then need to be passed around, which minimizes and avoids a lot of the complications that there are on XPages, and minimizes passing stuff around and needing to define a lot more than you actually do. So next, I've talked about the component tree. There are a couple of Java classes that I want to come on to now, which are very relevant around the component tree and repeat controls. So the first is the controlling view handler, and this is responsible for setting up that component tree, that tree of the components for the X page. It runs before the before page load event runs, and it creates that tree of components, which then in the before page load it iterates over and processes them. It also creates view scope, and this is why we got that error at the start, because it's creating the component tree. It's processing it was processing the domino document data source, which required a view scope variable which hadn't been set up yet. That's why that whole thing failed, because it's this controlling view handler which sets up that view scope. I found out about this really from working with Jesse Gallagher's Frostilicus framework, where he uses a controlling view handler, and what he does is variables get loaded to request scope first, then it calls this super.createView method, which loads up the component tree, and then it moves all those variables from request scope to view scope. That then clarifies really what these variables and the variable resolver kind of do. We added the panel, we added the data source to the panel, so this is what that particular chunk of code does. We added the data source to the panel, and just with this repeat control, the variable name for person and for IDEX were being set up here. And the reason they then work here and we can't access this row outside of it is because those elements are set into, they're created as it hits that element, and then it's dumped. Similar to request scope, but an even tighter scope. It's down to a particular component that those variables are set up, and then they're removed. So adding a data source to a panel means that it's available. It exists for a smaller scope than the whole page, which can be a bit of a gotcha if you're adding it into, if you're not adding panels within it, but can be better for performance because it's not going to be looking through as many variables. So basically any variables in your application, so document one, person, IDEX, but also things like database, session, view scope, session scope, request scope, they're all variables. So it's going to be looking for that variable anywhere in all of those scopes, and also the tighter scopes for within particular components. So actually, if you're dumping those a bit quicker, then there's less for it to need to look through, and that's why also you can get away without using request scope or view scope, because it will look through those scopes automatically, as well as everything else. And it's why with Jess's framework, for example, he's just using a variable name, and it's picking up from request scope before super.createView, and it's picking up from view scope afterwards. So variables are an interesting element around those component trees. And setting up the component, that view handler, if you want to do that, is just done by adding this code to the faces config. It's similar to a managed bean, it's just slightly different syntax there. Phase listener is much more useful, and this allows you to output which phases in a partial refresh the code is running through. That's again a Java class and a piece of code that goes into the faces config. Here it's registering this particular class. So I've got a class called power.ofLove example phase listener, which is and it's telling it it's a phase listener and to add it to the lifecycle. So the partial refresh goes through a number of phases. The first one is restore view, where it goes and gets that component tree again, and either from memory or from disk. Then it does apply request values, and here it's passing the strings from the browser so that to each component, so that the server processing can do stuff with it. Some of the things that it does with it are running validators and converters in process validations. So if you've got a number field, for example, that needs to be a number. So there needs to be a conversion that takes place. If you've got a field that's a required field, it's got to have a validator on there to check that it's not null. So this is where the validation happens in process validations. After it's then tested all of that, it then runs update model values, where it converts those string values, which are now validated, and it's confirmed that they can be actually converted, and it updates the value property in each of those components. Then it runs typically runs your business logic in the invoke application phase, and then render response, where it generates the HTML and posts the HTML for the relevant refresh area back to the browser. If there's any validation or conversion errors, then it will drop out at process validation and throw out any errors. If you've set immediate equals true, then it will run the business logic in apply request values phase and go straight out. That's typically for your cancel buttons, for example. So what I've got here is we can see that I've got one Paul. I'm clicking update. I've got a mandatory field here, and nothing's happening. This is a scenario that happens very often, and there have been a number of situations where that kind of question has cropped up on Stack Overflow. The key here is in the repeat area. If I just open up that XPage, oh, no, wrong one, this one. So on that update, I'm telling it to run a partial refresh, but only to update the full name field. I've got an errors block up here, but of course that errors block isn't in the area that's being refreshed. So nothing's telling the user that there's a problem until you look at the server, and then you can see that it goes through restore view, apply request values phase, process validations, and then render response. And because of the level of logging that I've got on the server, it is actually writing out a message to the browser to say that to the server console to say that validation errors haven't been displayed. Typically, you won't have that on there, so all you would see is just nothing on the server and nothing on the browser. But with the phase listener, and there are good examples on Xsnippets for that, then you can see that it's going through, restoring view, apply request values, process validations, and then it's skipping out. So it's hitting a validation error there. If I then fill in the fields, then it's working fine, and we can see it going through all 6 phases. I mentioned that also conversion errors, if I put a non-numeric value in the order, then we can see it's going through process validations and it's failing again, because it can't convert that non-numeric number to text. If I just put that to table 1, I think is the correct component. Let me just make sure. Yep. Then now we get that error message that the field is not a valid number. What I've also done with the submit button is add some validation, add a rendered formula on there, so that if a field isn't filled in, then it doesn't show it. If first name or last name isn't filled in, then it doesn't show it. Similarly, if there's any error message, it won't show it, which is a nice little bit of user interface there. It is going to need something then to trigger a partial update to show or hide that. So it may have more impact on the user lifecycle than actually you want to do for it. But I did have someone who asked how to do that kind of thing, so work that out. So on that button on the rendered property, so I'm setting it, but it's worth bearing in mind that the rendered property calculates multiple times in the life cycle of the page, so that typically that will calculate I think it's twice in each of those 6 phases in a partial refresh. You can optimize that by using if view.isRendering phase, so that now it's only running in the render response phase when it's passing that content back to the browser. So we've got a submit button, which will only, the rendered property will only be calculated when it's pushing the content back to the browser. So it's slightly better optimized. However, when we submit and we're saving the document, so new doc should go to false, it doesn't. This is where I was too clever for my own good and caused myself problems. So when I was troubleshooting that, my first step then was to use a phase listener to check, was it hitting some validation error? Was it running through all 6 phases? And it is. It's running through the update model values, which is where it should run the save event there, which is calling document1.save, and it's not doing that print statement. It's not printing anything out to the server console. This is where that rendered property and why that rendered property is calculating in multiple phases. I'm saying that if it's view.rendering phase, then do these various calculations. The else, obviously there, the else statement, there isn't an else statement, so the default for a Boolean is false. So this button is not rendered in any of the other phases, and therefore the event handler that is a child of it, as far as the server is concerned, also isn't rendered. So the action code for it doesn't exist, so it doesn't run it. In order to get that to display and to work, I need to tell it, if it's render response phase, run the code, otherwise just return true. And now it does set that value to false. Just a couple of things. There is, on the view data source in version 9, there was a setting for data cache equals ID, which means that it just caches the ID, not the full view entry, so not all columns of the view, which is better for performance. However, that then can throw errors if you're using that view entry. So on this particular one, I'm doing a get column values of it. If we look at the server console, then we see that it's hitting that error, and with the phase listener, we can see that it's hitting in apply request values. Because it's only got the ID in its cache, at this point where it's trying to run that server-side code, it only has the ID. It doesn't have the notes XSP view entry. So as far as the notes XSP view entry method that it's trying to call get column value on, that view entry is null at this point. If I change the data cache to, if I didn't set data cache equals ID, or I used wrapped that in a if view.is rendering phase, then it'll work fine. Another one to bear in mind there is Dialogs. With the extension library, we got a lot of useful functionality, one of which was the Dialogs, which also gives server-side code for opening and closing the dialogs. So the server-side code, I'm using the server-side JavaScript to take this view scope variable, put it into a view scope variable, and I think I'm updating a part of the page, so that's all. I'm using server-side JavaScript on that confirm button to close the dialog. What's important there is that closing the dialog can't be done server-side because you're affecting the browser. So you can't run any code on the server to close a dialog on a browser. What you have to do is, in the response, pass client-side JavaScript to close that dialog, and run that on the browser. I'm then refreshing this area of the page, which is what the GET request is then doing. It's getting the updated HTML for that part of the page. So it's not, even though you're writing server-side JavaScript to close the dialog, it's not closing the dialog with server-side JavaScript. It's passing client-side JavaScript to close the dialog and running another partial refresh to get the updated area of the page. Another one that came out just last week was around refreshing and updating, and so we've got a submit. Let's just go to that page. So we've got a number of buttons here. We've got the normal submit, which is doing a save and a full update. A submit and reload, which is doing a context.reload page. Submit and redirect to previous, which is doing a context.redirect to previous. Full page load is not actually reloading the componentry at all. It's just running through all the phases and sending back all the content for the current page, including the current view scope object. So all your Domino document data sources, for example, will be the same document. It will be the same document. It will be the same document saved here. It won't be a new document. In order to reinitialize those data sources, then you need to do context.reload page. And now we see that it's running through those. It's also then in invoke application phase injecting the code to create a new componentry and rendering that response. So we've got a new page, a new componentry at the back end, and a new set of data sources there. Submit and redirect to previous. That's an interesting one because now it's running through the same componentry, and it's doing a redirect to the previous, which that was a bad choice there because the previous page was actually the same page. Let me just do that again. So now it's going back to that home page, but it's actually injecting that again in the invoke application phase. So now we've got a different XPage injected in there and just render response. So it's interesting to see the life cycle that's going on there. This is all around, unless you're using single copy XPage design, all of these elements won't require a restart of HTTP. jar files will, and there's been a few questions about that, and plugins, if you're changing plugins, will. Quickly now, so this is running out. This was a question I think that I picked up where it was someone who got a picker. They could see the options that were there, but when they clicked on the picker, it wasn't working. Well, that's because the options for that picker aren't being set when the person clicks the button. They're being set in the component tree and just retrieved when someone clicks the button. So even though I can see the options here, those options are actually being set in the before render response after they're needed for the value picker. If I'd set these in the before page load, it would have been fine, and I wouldn't have got that resp is null, which basically means that it hasn't got any options. That's what that message means. The other one here is server-side JavaScript in client-side JavaScript. So I've got two buttons here. One that's using alert with some server-side JavaScript in there to get the field value, and that one, it's not picking up what's currently there. That's because it sounds obvious when you say it, but you can't run server-side JavaScript in a browser. Server-side JavaScript runs server-side. So if I look at that button, and its ID is button 1, so the event handlers are put all at the bottom in the script, and that it's this one here. So there, where I got on the server-side alert with some server-side JavaScript, that server-side JavaScript is run server-side, and the result is put in its place in the client-side JavaScript. So all I'm getting is the value as it was when this page was last, or this event handler was last refreshed to the browser. In order to get the current value here, that's where I need to use dojo.byId or something similar, and pass the relevant client-side ID in order to access it. And then it picks up the correct value. Similarly, as we were saying elsewhere, if you're wanting to get that client-side ID or something like that from a repeat control, you're not going to have access to it. So that's why when you would want to pick up, use CSS, for example, to set a style on it so that you can access it. Last one, just quickly, is around what you can store in various scopes. So I've got a set view scope, which is creating a notes date time and setting that into a view scope variable, which is being displayed just above it. And that seems to work well. When I refresh that area of the page, it disappears. This is because that domino objects can't be stored in any scopes. They can't be stored in any properties of managed beans. They can't be stored anywhere which is written down, either written down into memory or written down to disk. That's because in order to avoid it's the same kind of process as Java agents, really. the session and all its descendants get recycled at the end of every request. So that request is this request, this request, this request. If we go to the page load, where's my page load? This request. So each of those requests, which whether it's loading the page, whether it's doing a partial refresh, at the end of that request, session and all its descendants, which includes the date time object that I've just put into ViewScope, get recycled. So when I refresh that area, that notes date time object doesn't exist. That seems to work fine, and it continues to work fine whilst I have the persistence settings as keep pages in memory. There have been a number of instances where people have had this problem where it's then changed to keep only the current page in memory, and if you change those persistence options, if you change the XSP properties, then you need to do a clean of the database. And again, then, if I come to this page, it again seems to work fine. I refresh, it goes as I had before, but then when I then go to another page, my whole application is broken. So the initial thought then is to look for something on this welcome page that's broken everything, because I'm getting the error 500 on the welcome page. The problem though isn't on the welcome page. The problem is when we look at the stack trace with the lifecycle, and particularly the error on there. It's a java.io not serializable on the date time, and it's a problem at the end of that render response of the previous page. It's when it's trying to it's when it's trying to write to disk the previous page, this erased page. It's not easy to work out that it is this page, not this page, that's the cause of the problem, unless you're aware of that, of what that not serializable message means. It can also be a very difficult and time-consuming task to track down that it's this piece of code which is the culprit. When I've seen those kind of questions on Stack Overflow, it's been days before the responses has been that yes, it was a domino object, something from the domino object model trying to be stored in scope, and failing and causing a problem. It's been days before that's been tracked down. So basically, don't store domino objects in scope or in scope variables or in properties of managed beans or in as the output for a function in a server-side JavaScript library. Just if you try to store those, you will get bitten at one time, and it will take a long time to pin it down. So just summarizing all of that, ignore request params. It seems like a painful way of doing it, but actually having ignore request params equals true on a subsequent data source if you need it is actually the easiest way around it. Save button. Oh yes, coming back to that first one where it was saving the second data source twice, that was because the save button was a submit button. So the submit button saves all data sources on the page. It doesn't just save the one that you want it to. I try to avoid those simple actions because at the end of the day, document1.save, you know fairly early on in your XPages life what document1 is. You know calling .save on it to save that data source is intuitive. It's straightforward. If you're using the server-side JavaScript, if you're using that object model, you know exactly what it's doing. Whereas with a simple action, you may have misunderstood what you think it's doing. Keep edges in memory can be good, but you need to be aware of the impacts. View state equals no state on X agents is a very strong recommendation. Decels on client equals true can be extremely useful for just slightly improving the performance and avoiding that round tripping, and understanding the relationship between the component tree and repeat controls. Just being aware that server-side JavaScript runs server-side, client-side JavaScript runs client-side. You can inject one into the other. And understanding the tools to troubleshoot the whole lifecycle area, which is not just the phase listener, it's also something like Firebug to see what the situation is on the browser. So, thank you, and I shall now pass back to, who should I pass back to? Howard?
Yeah, I'll do it, Paul. Thank you.
All right. Yep.
Well, thanks, Paul. We get a couple questions queued up, and just a reminder to everyone, if you want to ask a question, use the questions panel of the GoToWebinar interface. And while people are possibly putting in a question, just some upcoming events. The only thing, there's 2 events coming up. Connect, of course, is now in San Francisco in February, a little later than it normally is. And Theo has announced the location and dates for the Engage conference in Belgium in May. Also, I don't have it on the chart, but plans are underway for the MWLUG conference, which will be held in Washington, D.C. this year, and that will be in August. You want to do your long-range planning, talk to your bosses about getting conference time. So, Paul Delanebbia, do you have some questions lined up?
I have a question from Saba. So this is a question related to the repeat controls and sorting. So if I use a view as my data source in a repeat control, and I filter the view by column value, will the resulting data keep the sort order of the view? And if not, how do I do that?
I think if you're just using a domino view data source and just filtering on a category, then it's basically using a under the hood. It's going to be using a view navigator, and it's effectively I would expect going to be doing view navigator dot create nav from. I think that's the method. So it's creating a view navigator just for that particular category. So it will be, it should be sorted. View navigators are used extensively for those data sources, I think, because it's much better performance than view entry collections typically. It should still be sorted.
Okay, and okay. I can confirm that tends to be the case when you're using a view data source. The sorting is retained when filtering afterwards.
Okay, we have a question from Simon. Paul, I guess in your console you had some kind of expanded messages in the console. So like Simon asked, what are the typical debug values that we'd want to add to the notes.ini to show XPages errors? What would you suggest?
There was the one that shows that there had been errors that may or may not have been sent to the browser. I can't remember what setting that is in the notes in the I'll dig that out. But yeah, I can't remember what that was. Someone did. I think I asked the question in a chat somewhere, and or in a session once, and someone mentioned what it was. But there's that one. But really, the key around there is making sure that any partial refresh where you've got editable controls on the page includes an area with a display errors block. Really, that's the key one there. In terms of where I was outputting the various lifecycle bits and when it was running in before page load, all I did for the before page load, after page load, before render response, after render response was just put a print and the relevant area in those events on my it was on the layout custom control that I was using. So there's nothing particularly sophisticated there. I was using the controlling view handler to print out when it was creating the component tree and saving it, and using the phase listener to print out the relevant phases. Those I'll make sure that there's a link to the demo database. Actually, it's up on my Bitbucket. I forgot to include the link for that, but it's bitbucket.org/Paul S. Withers, and it's BTTF, Back to the Future. But that's got the demo database, which has those two Java classes in it, which are the keys for picking out what phases it's running through.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Let's see, we had, I think you kind of covered this one. Ivana said, when is it okay to use the property view equals no state?
It's basically when XAgents, I would definitely use it. Anywhere else, if it's a read-only page and it's not really going to be interacted with, or you're only using buttons or events on there that just want to set the state something relative to the default state, then use it. So something like a view control there, like the data view, where I just got expand all, collapse all, or expand show details, and I just got a pager to jump to page 3, page 5, page 7, but no page forward or page back, then that would work fine. It's really if it's not going to have a partial refresh back to the server, and you don't care about the current state, you're basically making it stateless, like any AngularJS web page or whatever, anything that's not stateful, like JSF based or Vardin. So if you wanted to use a pager, you'd need to kind of construct it yourself and pass back or store in a scope variable the current page that it's on. No, sessions. I think you might be able to, you need to store in session scope and completely reload the page, and set the first to that session scope variable. So you'd need to kind of either store it all and use your interaction just on the browser, or do a full reload of the page and change the variables in order to do something that's relative to where they last were.
Okay, or just not use it in that case. Might be easier.
XPages is the definite place to use it though.
Right, yes, I've used that before. Okay, good.
Also, actually, if you've got a page that's being used for REST to just return JSON, again, you can't interact with that relative to what the last state was. So something that's just returning JSON data, again, make that view state equals no state.
Okay, great. Well, I think it appears that we have no more questions. So I'd like to thank you again, Paul, for coming and presenting your session from Connect. A lot of good information in there for folks to think about and start to implement. And thanks to my fellow co-hosts, Paul and Courtney. And I'd like to, just a reminder, I think everyone is aware of this, but we will put up the recording of this session along with the slides in a day or two, and we'll send out an email to everyone who registered for this webinar, even those who did not attend. And I'd like to wish everybody a great rest of 2016 and all the best for 2017. And I hope everyone's holiday season is relaxing and fun. And we'll catch everyone next year.